No, that's because you're
You never know.
No, he loves the volleyball team.
He's a little bit creepy.
no, dude, he's the creepy one.
Brad Monster. They literally have policies that with female students.
All right, the Praxis is having a speaker on Thursday, April 4th, coming Thursday at 7 p.m. in Dow B. It's going to be speaking on entrepreneurship and living life well, sustainable prosperity, and Austrian economics. So anyway, again, that's Thursday at 7 in Dow B. He says, Dr. Chapman will offer insights about how economies grow, focusing on the crucial nature of entrepreneurship. He will include a detailed case study of an entrepreneur in action, illustrating how he got crushed by a cruel fate via ersatz government policy, which is a word I don't know much. E-R-S-A-T-Z. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but thereby losing his company and his wealth, forcing him to start all over again at age 61. So he's going to talk about Austrian economics and how this all fits. So if you have a moment at 7 o'clock on Thursday, you might stop by Dow. And then last time we were talking about, oh yeah, and also don't forget the review session is Monday night in lane 125. Okay. Again, over the weekend, make sure that you've looked at the old exams and developed answers to them. It should be, there's never any surprises on my tests. You should be able to have a pretty good idea what the questions are. So make sure that you've taken a look at the old exam questions and have an outline in your head when you walk in. Last time we were talking about what you need for progress, and we said that for progress to occur, you need two things. One is you need property rights, and that's been emphasized by every author so far. It's also going to be emphasized by Liddell and Rosenberg. If you want to have people have an incentive to be innovative, then you're going to need to have property rights. And the second thing is we said you had a belief in the individual. And in particular, one is that what we've suggested is the unit of account. That is, it's the individual that's important rather than the tribe or your country or government or wherever you want to do it. That is, we talked about the movie Ants, and that the Woody Allen character is making the point that you form the anthill to make the ants better off, whereas the leaders of the anthill are saying that the ants are supposed to be the ones that are, they're there to make the anthill better. And so when you have an idea that you're there to make the anthill better, then you're not going to be as innovative. You're not going to believe that the individual is the thing that we're dealing with. And second is, we said that, we haven't really brought this up, but we're about to talk about it, is that we talked a little bit about it, a belief that the individual can make a difference. Because if you don't have that belief, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about the feudal period in How the West Grew Rich, that you guys got to believe that you can innovate and that you can be the one that creates a new product or new ways of doing things. If you don't think about the individual being able to do any of this stuff, then you're not going to get innovation. You're not going to get an increase in the standard of living. And in a moment, we'll talk about that's what was characteristic of the feudal period during the 900 to 1450 AD. You had very little economic growth, very little innovation. And one of the reasons was because if you were a serf, you didn't think, oh, wow, maybe I should develop a new way of developing maybe fertilizer, right? Or developing a new way to do a plow, because that wasn't what your attitude was. And again, why is it that this period had very little economic growth? Things looked pretty much the same in 1400 that they did in 1200. Is because the only people that can make a difference are the heroes, right? That's why you were a hero. If you saw the movie Hercules, the cartoon, that's what Phil does, right? Phil takes Hercules around, then he takes him to Thebes, because if you can make it in Thebes, you can make it anywhere, right? It's sort of the equivalent of you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. And so what's going on there is Hercules is the one that can make a difference, right? How many have ever seen that movie? Okay, good. Right. Sometimes I wonder about you guys' education when you were younger. But yeah, Phil's going Hercules. Yeah, you can make a difference, right? You're a hero. But not everybody was thinking they could make a difference. Whereas today, what are you taught, right? Most Americans are taught, yeah, you can go off and do, try whatever you want, right? You're capable of becoming, chief executive officer of Johnson & Johnson, okay? Now, this is this big thing about women being able to be successful in STEM. I'm not exactly sure what STEM is, but I think it's got something to do with it's like science and other things to add up to STEM. But the point there is that you can do this, right? That wasn't the attitude for centuries in the West. The attitude for centuries was that the only people that can make a difference are the heroes. So again, we talked last time about the fact that it took centuries to go from a two-wheeled from the wheel to a two-wheeled cart to four-wheeled carts. Wyatt Earp was, an adult when four-wheel carts are what you had. By the time he died, there was the Model A, the Model T. People had cars, they had talking motion pictures. Tom Mix was at his funeral. And so you get this rapid increase in innovation. And why that's happening is because you've changed the way that you organize yourself. The Greeks knew the principle of how to do the steam engine 3,000 years ago. Right? So 3,000 years ago, you could have had a steam engine, but they never did anything with it, right? Because there was no incentive for them to innovate and have a steam engine. Okay? So they knew the principles of it, but they just never decided to develop it. If you look at what happened in navigation, right? Like if you look at 4,000 years ago, the Phoenicians were going around with oars and sails, and then the Romans are using slave galleys to row the boats around. Then by the time we get to the 1700s, the French have combined sails and rowing, sort of gotten back to what the Phoenicians had. And then today, you have Carnival Cruise Line, right? So you got 5,000 people on the boat, and you've got entertainment and all sorts of food and swimming pools and everything else on the cruise ship. So it looks a lot different. So things aren't much different between 4,000 years and getting to 1700s, and then all of a sudden this vast increase in innovation. That's true of almost anything that we think about. And so again, if you look at in China. What happened there was, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later on, But until 1911, the emperor was the person that was in charge of everything, and the idea wasn't that you could solve a problem. The emperor had power over all the subjects. Very much of a feudal sort of situation. And then you got communism, right? And so Mao's in control, so you got central planning, so you go from feudalism to central planning, which isn't much different, as Hayek pointed out in The Road to Serfdom. And so China wasn't doing anything for a very long time. They were way ahead of the rest of the world in the 15th century, but fell behind when they decided to separate themselves out from international trade. Notice that if we look at communism or any other form of central planning, it can't be dynamic. Communism, socialism, any of these forms of central planning they're not dynamic. It can only work in a world that doesn't change very frequently. If you think of the central planner today, how are they going to know, how are they going to operate when you guys have a different GPS system, right? We're going to put new satellites up there, and we're going to find ways to do this so that you will be able to know where you are in the grocery store or whatever. Who knows, by the time, 10 years from now, you'll walk into the Walmart and you'll you want to know where the donuts are, and you'll do something. You'll press some sort of kiosk or something, and it'll tell you where the donuts are, so you don't have to hunt your way through the store. So we know that you live in a dynamic world. You guys don't expect that 50 years from now you're going to have the same type of cell phone that you do today. You don't even expect that 5 years from now that you're going to have the same cell phone that you do today. But if this were 1300, you would, or in a centrally planned state, how can that person know exactly how much of different things you want, but also to know what you're going to enjoy in the future? What are the things that you're going to want? Facebook, for example, 15 years old, right? If this were 20 years ago, there wasn't anything called Facebook or Snapchat or any of these. What's the thing that goes away? Instagram. All this social media stuff didn't exist even 15 years ago. And so today, you expect to be able to communicate that way. Certainly, Facebook didn't come from central planning, right? And that billions of people use it. I don't. What? Why would you ever, I just understand this, right? People put all their information out there and then expect that somehow they're not going to monetize that, right? Or you're going to say, oh, by the way, in case anybody wants to rob my house, I'm in Greece for 2 weeks, right? But that's okay. People do it. But anyway, innovation. I would not have thought, if I were the Lord or if I were the head of the Soviet Union, I wouldn't be thinking, oh, wow, maybe we should invent a social media platform, right? So the communism, socialist, central planning, they're made for worlds that aren't very dynamic. Where are the most dynamic economies? The most dynamic economies are coming out of places that have market capitalism. Another thing is that historically what turned out was when the rulers weren't very powerful, right? When the rulers were not powerful enough to enforce their directives, you get economic growth. When you look at when did Rome start to have all sorts of problems, Rome started to have all sorts of problems when Diocletian was able to put wage and price controls out there to say, here's how much we're going to do all this central planning about how the agriculture is going to work, right? And of course, having read Mises, Mises has been around when Diocletian was there, he warned them that central planning can't be very efficient. And so places that have been capable of interfering, you don't get as much economic growth. In fact, if you look at when the stewards, they were too weak to enforce the regulations, and what happens, right? You get economic growth, and in particular, you get it in the colonies. We'll talk more about this later, but what happened was you weren't able to enforce the regulations that the British Parliament was putting on the colonies, and so the colonies are sort of running around having all sorts of economic innovation relative to what was going on in the rest of the world. And then we noted that in 1767, the British Parliament passes this resolution that says that they could pass any law that they want as long as they had a majority. And we saw that the founders, Otis and Sam Adams and those guys, said, hey, that can't be the case. And then what happens is King George III, right? What does he do? He tries to enforce these regulations, and in particular, taxes on tea, and what happens? Right, you end up with the Boston Tea Party. Right, and the colonies just, because why? Because the colonies have gotten used to being able to act according to their own plan. They have the stewards hadn't been very effective in dominating or directing what the colonists were going to do. King George III is trying to finance the 7 Years' War, and so that's where that led to a reaction from the colonies who had gotten used to being able to direct themselves. All right. Now let's take a look then at how the West grew rich. Okay, and so how the West grew rich is again the economic historians observing. Here's what happened in the West. And they know that the West got rich and the rest of the world didn't. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to divide it up into several periods. There's going to be a period 1900 to 1450, and this is the feudal period. And then 1450 to 1750, that's the era of trade, or often called mercantilism. And then 1750 to 1880, that's the Industrial Revolution. And then 1880 to 1913, that's the era of the corporation. You didn't have corporations in the 1700s, okay? And we'll talk about why the corporation came about. And then 1913 to the present, this is the era of growth of government. Particularly the federal government within the United States. So what Birdsell and Rosenberg start out with is an introduction, which is basically a summary of what they've observed. And when you go to study for the final, it's useful to go back and look at the introduction because it's a summary of what they do in the rest of the book. Okay? So, what do they figure out within the introduction? Is they said that why did the West grow rich, right? It grew rich because of innovation, which we've already talked about, right? You're not richer than the King of England was in 1260 because you got more tapestries, you got more wheat, or whatever that the king did. You got all sorts of stuff the king didn't have. Indoor plumbing, whatever. So forks, things that the King of England didn't have. And so what is the key to economic progress? Why did the West grow rich? It's because they had an economic and political system that drove innovation. You didn't have such a system, like I said. If this were the feudal period, you wouldn't be thinking that, I should be able to go out and develop something new. It's not even in your brain that could happen. You didn't believe that the individual could make a difference. And then he says that there is a decentralization of authority to make decisions. This is what they're observing. They're observing a decentralization of authority to make decisions. Now, that is what Hayek was saying that you need, right? Hayek says that how do you make the best use of knowledge? Everybody being able to act according to their own plan. So what did Birdsell and Rosenberg see happened in the West? They saw that innovation was the key to why the West grew rich and the rest of the world didn't. They saw that there was a decentralization of the authority to make decisions. That's what they observed. And then the third thing they observed is that market capitalism became the social order. That what happened in the it wasn't how India became rich. That's not the name of the book, or how Latin America became rich, or how Sub-Saharan Africa became rich. That's not what the book's about, right? The book says how the West grew rich. Because why? Because the West is the place that grew rich, and the rest of the places didn't. So what do they observe? They observe that this happened because of innovation, that there was a gradual decentralization of the ability to make decisions, and they used market capitalism as the way to organize ourselves. So that is exactly what the theory was about, right? That we've been talking about. Mises says the market capitalism is the only way to create wealth for the masses. The systems of central planning can't do that. What does Hayek say? The best use of decentralized information is you guys being able to act according to your own plan. And so the theory matches up with what happened historically. We've already noted that it matches up cross-sectionally. That is, you don't want to be the poorest person in Venezuela right now. You'd rather be the poorest person in Canada. And then we noted that the poorest people in the countries that are in the top 25% of the Index of Economic Freedom are 11 times wealthier than the poorest people in the bottom 25%. So then he goes through and says, okay, what are some other stories about how the West grew rich? Rather than this decentralization of authority to make decisions in the development of market capitalism, right? So there's basically other stories about it. One would be that the West grew rich because it had all sorts of natural resources. Okay? Well, that can't possibly be the right answer, because all I got to do is compare Hong Kong, which has almost no natural resources, and compare it to Venezuela, which is one of the countries with the largest amount of oil reserves is Venezuela, and they can't keep the lights on. I don't know if you've been following the last few days, but Venezuela's had nationwide blackouts. They had, now they're rationing electricity. And so this is a country with all sorts of natural resources, but dire poverty, whereas Hong Kong and Singapore are places with not very many natural resources, but enormous wealth. Second thing is, what about science? Okay, the West grew rich because it happened to get the greatest development of science. Well, the Brazil and Rosa have a whole chapter on science, but the point is that, okay, then what about Islamic societies? If this were 1400, right, or China, if this were 1400, that they were more advanced, right? They had more science. If you, I mean, think about what was going on in the West, right? What were the Romans doing? They were writing XIV plus III equals VII, right? And you've heard about the Arabic numeral system, right? What do they got? 0, 1 through 9, okay? What do you need for computers? 0 and 1, okay? There's no concept of 0 in the West. Then when the Crusades happen, what's going on is the Crusaders get there, and guess what? There's windows. There's glass windows, okay? And they're going, hocus smokes, but wait, what is that stuff, right? It keeps the flies from coming in. I still got the light going on, right? So the idea that somehow the West had better science just doesn't stand up. If that was the reason for the West getting having economic growth, why is it that these other countries that were well advanced, China was well advanced to the West in the 15th century. Their Chinese sailing ships could outperform anything that the West had. But China doesn't move itself into market capitalism. China withdraws in the 1500s. China withdraws from the world economy and world trade. So science can't be that. What about luck? Right? Well, luck doesn't work for centuries, right? The West has been wealthy for hundreds of years compared to the rest of the world. If it were just pure luck, you'd think that what would happen is, okay, so it'd be random, right? Sometimes sub-Saharan Africa would be really wealthy, and then Latin America would be really wealthy, and then the West might be really wealthy. But that isn't what happened, right? There's a consistent pattern here. The West got rich, it continues to get rich, and the rest of the world only gets rich when it starts to adopt some of the characteristics of the West. What about colonial exploitation? Okay, the West got rich because there was colonial exploitation. Well, there's a couple problems with that one. One is, how is it that the West got wealthy enough to exploit the colonies to start with? Why is it that the Inca didn't come over and colonize Europe, right? If colonial exploitation is the key to growth. But the more important thing is, it's expensive to have colonies. Read Adam Smith's An Inquiry into Nature and Cause of the Wealth of Nations. In it, he says, hey, let the colonies go. It's too darn expensive. We're taking care of them, right? We're defending them. We've got to pay for the administration of everything. We'd be a lot better off if we just let them go and we'll trade with them, right? If we want some of their stuff, we're not gonna colonize Mexico, right? We'll just trade with them, right? If we want Mexican oil, we'll just swap them. $60 a barrel for West Texas crude, and that's done, right? We don't have to admit. No one thinks that Puerto Rico, which is basically a colony of the United States, no one thinks having Puerto Rico somehow makes us wealthier, right? In fact, we spend tax dollars to keep Puerto Rico going, right? We'd be better off not having Puerto Rico involved at all. What did we learn? What Mises says, foundation of liberalism, slavery is just inefficient, right? Only free labor is efficient. Colonies are not going to be an efficient way of obtaining wealth, okay? you'd be much better off just simply to trade with them. And like I said, Adam Smith in 1776 was writing this very thing. Then what they point out is that there was a gradual relaxation of controls on people's behavior. This is what happened in the West. You get a gradual relaxation of control of people's behavior. Right? This is consistent with what Hayek was saying, right? Hayek is saying the best use of decentralized information is that you guys get to act according to your own plan. What do we see in the West? In the West, we observe exactly what Hayek was suggesting in terms of the theory. Britzel and Rosenberg say, here's what happened in the West. If we look at it historically, there was a gradual relaxation. Feudal period, you guys are the serfs, you don't get to do whatever you want. Okay? But today, we act like what was true of the Declaration of Independence, right? That government doesn't give us our rights, that we have natural rights, and government is created to enforce those natural rights, right? To protect ourselves. Then he says it's an oddity of Western growth, or they say it's an oddity of Western growth that it's benefited the lifestyle of the poor rather than the rich. So what do they observe historically? It's Western growth benefited, I don't know how to spell benefited. Is that right? Does that look like benefited?
Yeah.
All right. Nobody's gonna argue that's how we're gonna spell it. Okay? Sort of a spontaneous order here. It benefited the lifestyle of the poor rather than the rich. But right? That shouldn't be an audited Western growth, right? Because what did Mises say? He says the only way to create wealth for the masses is market capitalism. So what did we see happen in the West? We saw market capitalism as being the social order that develops in the West, and what do we observe? That the West gets wealthy, and in particular, that they say it's an oddity of Western growth that it benefited the poor more than it benefited the rich. But it's not an oddity if you'd read Mises, right? What we're going to see is that over and over again, Britzel and Rosenberg talk about things that Hayek has talked about or Mises has talked about without a reference to Hayek or Mises. They're just saying, here's what we discovered when we were looking at what went on in the West. So they also say the development of an economic sphere where individuals are allowed to engage in new activities, reap the rewards of their successes, and suffer the consequences of their failures, all without needing official position, is a characteristic of the West. Okay? So what does that say? It says that you have an economic sphere, right? You have a sphere of free action. It says that's one of the characteristics of the West, but of course, right? That's what Hayek was talking about. We said that's what Bastiat talked about. Hayek says that what the purpose of the law is to create a sphere of free action, right? Where you guys can act according to your own plan. That's going to make the best use of decentralized knowledge. What is a characteristic of the West? They said a characteristic of the West was this an economic sphere where individuals are allowed to engage in new activities, reap the rewards of their successes, and suffer the consequences of their failures. What is that about? That's about the chapter 8 that Hayek talked about, responsibility. Right? In the West, what happened is you became responsible for your actions. Wasn't the case in the feudal period, but how did the West grow rich? The West grew rich because you guys now reap the rewards of your success and suffer the consequences of your failures, which is what Hayek is talking about, right? When he's talking about how do I set up a system that makes the best use of decentralized knowledge. As a free society requires more than any other that people be held responsible for their actions. Why do we want that? We want it because Hayek says people will behave in a more efficient fashion, right? And if you're not responsible, then whoever is going to coerce you. So in the feudal period, what happens is you're not responsible for your actions, the Lord is. And so what happens? You guys don't feel you have responsibility, and so what happens? There's no or little any economic growth that occurs during that period. But what is a characteristic? Why did the West grow rich? And it's not how India grew rich or how Latin America grew rich. It grew rich because that's what happened in the West. We saw this development of an economic sphere where you guys are free to act according to your own plan, that you suffer the consequences of your failures and reap the benefits of your success. Then they also write that property rights are the key to innovation. Well, this is what we've been talking about throughout the whole class. Right? Property rights. To say that here's what happened. Why did the West grow rich? That property rights are the key to innovation, and property rights were well established in the West. If you ever looked at writings by Hernando de Soto, one of the things he focuses on is why is it that South America and Latin America haven't done very well, and what he argues is that's because they're not well-defined property rights, that they have failed to define property rights very well. And of course that's consistent with what Mises talked about, what Bastiat talked about, what Hayek talked about, what we just talked about, and what do we find? We find in the West that they got well-defined property rights, and once they got that, then they got innovation. All right, so let's take a quick look at. We'll start out with a quick look at what was going on in the feudal period. All right, so we said that. I've noticed that my board handwriting is starting to deteriorate, so I'm trying to get back on that. So anyway, the feudal period, we said that was 900 to 1450. What are the characteristics? And you'll notice that on the old exams, on the finals, what you'll look at is I'll always ask for 2 different periods for you to tell me what are the characteristics of this period, what are the important aspects of this period, what aspect of this period led to the development of market capitalism or something like that. Why is it, we're gonna discover that one of the things that happened in the feudal period was this idea of limited government, the Magna Carta, and that's what you need for market capitalism to develop. So we developed, over time, we developed an attitude towards limited government. So anyway, we start out with the feudal period. One major characteristic of the feudal period is it was primarily agricultural. Most people were involved in agriculture. Now you'll notice that if you look at a society today that's primarily agricultural, they're going to be poor, right? Look at let's say the Democratic Republic of Congo. Okay, most of the people are out there engaged in agriculture. And so if you have that's what was going on in the West in the feudal period. Most people were just engaged in agriculture, just trying to grow enough food. A second characteristic of it was that political and economic authority were combined. Right? That is, the Lord was the one that decided, here's what we're going to grow, here's how we're going to grow it, here's the tools you're going to use, here's who's going to be working where. All this was decided by the Lord, but the Lord also was the one that had executive authority, legislative authority, judicial authority. So when Hayek was talking about the rule of man rather than the rule of law, that's what he was talking about. That is this, and what we'll note when we actually get into some detail here is that the lords were the ones that had political authority and economic authority the lords were on the manor, and in the towns, it was the guilds. You can think of Dorothy when she lands in Munchkin Land. She's met with a bunch of people, but one of the people that meet her are the Lollipop Guild, right? And so that probably tells you this was probably, Munchkin Land was more in a feudal system than it was in a market capitalist system. Which now whenever you see, whenever you see that movie from now on, you'll always, think about that. Like, welcome her to Munchkin Land with the Lollipops. It'd be sort of a nerdy thing to think about, but it'll happen. All right. A third thing is the terms of exchange were set by They're set by custom and tradition. They were not market clearing. So if you were, having a discussion, one of the things you'd be talking about is a just price. The idea that there was a just price. This price is unjust. The rate at which you exchange wool for wheat, okay, that wheat's determined by our belief that this is fair, right? There's some idea of a just price. Notice that when people talk about different prices, should the government have price controls on things, what are they saying? There's some just price, some fair price out there, and we want that to happen. Is that price likely to be market clearing? Perhaps, but perhaps not. There's a just wage, right? Minimum wage is that similar idea, that wages that are below this standard ought to be set by essentially maybe not custom and tradition and as it was in the feudal period, but rather be set by what the government can do. But this is a similar attitude that if this were the 1300s, we would be talking about what's the just price for things. We wouldn't be talking about market clearing prices. Now, there wasn't a lot of things to worry about, right? You didn't have to think about, well, gee, what should be the relative price between the latest Samsung telephone and the new Miata car, right? You didn't have any of that stuff. So maybe it was sort of easier to come up with a just price in those days because there wasn't lots of things that they were trading around, okay? But nonetheless, we're going to find out that when we look at this gradual evolution, which is what Hayek talked about, right? Hayek said there's social evolution. And that's what happened in the West. We went from feudalism to mercantilism or Arab trade to the Industrial Revolution to full-blown market capitalism. Okay, so as we made that movement, we moved away from this idea of just price to market clearing prices. And there was the society there was what you were preoccupied with. You were preoccupied with getting enough food. Right, that's what people were, all their life, that's what they were thinking about. So, you do have some examples of art and things like that, but where do you start getting, paintings and the like? It isn't until you've moved away from this feudal system and started to go into the Arab trade. People became wealthy enough that they could do something else. Because why? Because there's an opportunity cost to your time, right? Agriculture is not very productive, and so if you're out doing something else, then you might not have enough food to eat. So this movement towards you know, as we move away from a society that is primarily agricultural, just so low productivity that everybody, all you're trying to do is survive. If this were Somalia, probably looking like this, right? If this were Somalia, you're not thinking, oh, should I get the latest 5G network and how much is it going to cost if I use Verizon? That's not what you're thinking about, right? You're thinking about whether you're going to starve to death. If you look at, there's millions of people, even if you're in Venezuela right now, or if you are in Yemen, right? Millions of people starving in Yemen today. What are they sitting around thinking about? How am I going to get enough food to survive on? That's what they're thinking about. You guys aren't thinking about that because you have been living in a market capitalist system that's been in existence for hundreds of years, right? But I got, you know, all you got to do is show up in Yemen and look at all these children. I mean, you probably don't see it on, well, you won't see it on mainstream media, but if you look at BBC America or whatever, then they will bring you news about what's going on in the rest of the world. And those places that aren't market capitalist, there are millions of people that are at risk of starvation out there today. All right, so for Monday, we will probably get through this chapter on the feudal period. Monday evening is the review session, and then Wednesday's the exam. Again, emphasize it a million times, but make sure you've gone through the old exams and have in your brain, okay, here's some characteristics of the feudal. That's on the final. Okay, skip that. Here's what some of the characteristics of a law ought to be. If what Steig talks about, if it's going to minimize the total amount of coercion, right? To talk about it being, able to comply in general and avoidable and known and predictable. So have that in your head when you walk in there. All right, so see you Monday.
We're up, dude.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm not
Oh, could be both. Yeah. That's a good question. You can conceivably say that. Well, I mean, sort of think about it. Why did we form government in the first place? Right? 'Cause we need to work that. Provide a self-defense. Yeah. Right? That's John was talking about. Collective organization of that.
Usually I go home just right after this class.
Then you might say, well, gee, you should volunteer your time to be, in the defense.
Yeah.
Okay. The problem with that is you've got this opportunity cost.
Yeah.
Right? Now, again, Mises in his book, Human Action, he argues that people should have to join the army or do something like that, even though it's costly to do that.
Yeah.
That trade-off. So you could argue that, you may say, well, gee, if I'm going to be in this community, I have some responsibility towards the community.
Yeah.
But the reasoning would have to be that in the absence of that, then the community would fall apart, and it wouldn't be able to do the thing that it needs to do. Like if this were, why would you have human sacrifice?
Yeah.
Well, human sacrifice.
Well, I was just thinking more like the mechanic. The society needs the mechanic. The mechanic needs the society.
Well, but the market's going to make that happen, though, right?
Yeah.
If there's a need for a mechanic, then somebody's going to say, hey, I'm going to start to be a mechanic. And if there's a shortage of mechanics, the wages will go up and people will doing that now. So. They do. Yeah. They do. In fact, I just wrote a piece in Fox Business about how free tuition at colleges and universities misdirects people. Right now there's a 50,000, a shortage of truck drivers, about 50,000. And truck drivers can earn about $80,000 a year. Truck drivers are sort of an interesting one because there are
The other thing.
only like 2% of truck drivers are
Essentially,
Yeah.
and so
Wow, I think
how do you,
Sam's way there for you.
what is it that
That's
keeping
really
females from
like
joining the
he's really
truck
smart
drivers?
and we're kind of
It's gonna be kind of crappy work.
It's probably crappy work,
Haven't done it, it's kind of crappy
and
work.
they don't think about it,
Yeah.
right? Probably nobody in this